button on this. And I'm also going to go live on Facebook here.
Ooh, I've never been live on Facebook before.
Yeah, I mean, everybody's doing it these days. You know, it's where all the action is. It's being a little bit finicky. I think the connection that I have here is perhaps a bit finicky. So Nan,
yeah.
Do you happen to have access to the administrative tools? Do you know?
That's rather vague. The administrative tools.
Yeah. So if you hover over the
on the Zoom.
On the Zoom.
Okay.
And there's the area that says more. Those three dots.
Okay, more on the bottom.
Yeah. If you click on that, does it give you the option to go live on Facebook?
I don't think I have the same set of choices on the bottom of my screen. I don't see the three dots.
So I'm the host. So
you're the host.
I think that's
yeah.
That's why I seem to have gotten.
But you could make me the host. If you make me the host, I could do that.
I think mine's working now. It just it took it a little bit longer to get there from here than it does from Arden, but we got there. There's
good.
The mountainous roads are more difficult over here, I guess. So
your buttons think they're on vacation.
Exactly. Have another person coming into the meeting here. Yeah, I think the lesson in North Georgia is everything just takes a minute longer. Is all. We just have to be. I just have to be more patient. So. Okay, so we are going live on Facebook now as well. It looks like we're live. So that's great. Hey, Rob, good to see you.
Hi.
So I want to thank y'all for being here for this is our fourth conversation on Zoom, which the first one or two felt like, I don't know, like maybe not going to the moon, but certainly, you know, putting something in orbit anyway. And now it's like routine. So I'm glad that we have been able to do this. We'll have this conversation tonight, and of course, this is being recorded, and we'll share it to our YouTube stream as well, and have it up there for folks to come back and look at. And then we're going to take a little break, a little pause, and then come back and transition from this format into having more conversations, giving people the opportunity to maybe tell some of their stories, talk about their thoughts about Calvary and so forth. So we'll take a little break in mid-August and then come back towards the end of there, you know, around Labor Day, ready to get back to work, just like people all over the country do. So I want to say thank you so much to Kimberly Floyd for joining us tonight. Kimberly is the manager of the Zebulon Vance Birthplace Historical Site near Weaverville in northern Buncombe County, way out on Reeves Creek. And I'll let her tell you a little bit more about her background, but she has training that I didn't even know to be jealous of until she told me that it existed. You know, the idea of being trained in public history, I think is fantastic. And so, Kimberly, if you don't mind, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, and maybe a little bit of the work y'all are doing at the Vance Birthplace?
Sure. I'm not on mute or anything, am I? Y'all can hear me okay? Okay, good. So I have been working in museums and historic sites for 14 years now. My undergrad was in history at Meredith College, and then I went to NC State for graduate school and did their master's program in public history with a concentration in museum studies. So there are kind of a couple different ways you can go. Some people do archives, but I went the museums track. And I'm originally from Raleigh, so I've worked in various museums and historic sites. I was in the education department at the North Carolina Museum of History, doing like distance learning was one of my very first jobs there, which now is coming full circle, doing digital stuff, online school programs. And then I worked at Mordecai Historic Park in Raleigh, which was a plantation for 3.5 years. I've spent most of my time studying and working and interpreting antebellum North Carolina. So pre-Civil War, slavery in North Carolina, slavery in the country as a whole. From Mordecai, worked at Historic Stagville, which is a state historic site in Durham. It had 90,000 acres, or 30,000 acres and 900 enslaved people that we know of. So that was a very interesting site. If you're ever in Durham, I would strongly suggest you go there. Then was actually at the City of Raleigh Museum in downtown Raleigh for 4 years. That was a whole kind of different switch from historic sites. What you do in the two different spaces are really different, from using buildings to exhibits, etc. And then I've been at Vance for 4 years. So, that has been an interesting experience. Every site I've worked at and museum has been presented some similar challenges, different challenges, similar challenges when it comes to, interpreting, which we'll probably get into it at some point, what a lot of people call difficult history. What I have found is that it's not difficult history. What makes it difficult is how people react to it. It's a lot of the term that I will use and have used in the past is necessary history. So what we need to be talking about. So, that's really kind of my background in a nutshell. I have a lot of time and experience just working with the public and talking about, African American history, the institution of slavery, the ideologies around that, and working with people through that education process. Of all ages, we get a lot of school groups at all these different historic sites. So all the way from kindergarten to, adults. I've talked to a lot of school kids over the years. But that's the background. At Vance, that site's been really interesting to be at. At all of my other jobs, Mordecai, I was the education manager, so I was in charge of specifically the education programs. And then, at Stagville, I was the assistant site manager. At the museum, I was the assistant director. So Vance is the first place I've been where I've been able to really manage fully from the top the interpretive direction of the site. So some of the things we've been working on out there, there was a lot of research actually done for the last 10 years before I even got there. So the nice part was when I started, there was tons of content. When I say tons, I mean tons for researching African American genealogy, history. Being able to follow that takes time, and sometimes there's a lot and sometimes there's nothing. Western North Carolina presents some specific challenges in that, but the research was already done. So I was able to take that and really kind of run with it. I spent the first year just kind of experiencing the site, if that makes sense.
Sure.
Just kind of seeing like, what is the visitation, who's coming to the site, who's not coming to the site, and if they're not coming, like, why are they not coming to the site, and just talking to the community, or what kind of events are they doing, and what has been happening at the site. And so the first year and a half was really just kind of observing, and then year 2 was when I I launched a lot of new initiatives. We completely changed our tour. We have, really just kind of flipped the perspective on its head, and encouraged the staff at the site. There's only 3 of us full time, to really just think about, how people connect to history when they're coming to these historic sites. Why are they coming? What are they trying to get? And what is our mission to send them away with? And I would say, the mission of what to send them away with has changed. I changed that at the site. It was very much focused on mountain life and culture. And so they've been telling the story of slavery, but not quite in the same way. We interpret it as a mountain plantation. And so our goal now really is to help debunk the idea that slavery didn't exist in Western North Carolina, which is what I have found a lot of people were saying, and were surprised by us talking about. So that's really been the biggest change, I would say.
Right. And in terms of, well, I can give away my answer by the way I frame the question, so I'll just make it real simple. Why do you think that's important? Why do you think it's important to reframe the story in that way?
Well, I think it's important because I think it is important to tell a broad and inclusive narrative. So, it's important that we tell all of the stories at the site. It's important that we tell, the fact that it was originally Cherokee land. It's important that we're telling the story. There were 18 enslaved people living and working on that property, 11 Vance family members on that property. So it doesn't mean that, we're not telling the story of the Vances, or we're not telling the story of the Cherokee, but we are interpreting it as a plantation. Even David Vance Sr. describes it as that in some of the documents that we have. So, I think it's important to help people understand that it was a plantation and there were ideologies created there and existed there that would create foundations that are still impacting us today. And so I think the reason it's important for people to understand it is because you can learn about these plantation ideologies, and you can learn about what was happening on the Vance property, and you can also trace that basically and follow some of the things that, say, Vance is saying and doing later in his life, policies that he's supporting that, you know, as a leader figure is going to impact the entire community, all of North Carolina, if not larger. So, you know, it's important to understand all of those narratives. So that's really, you know,
Yeah.
for lack of a cliche, you know, people are always saying if you don't know history, you repeat yourself, you know, we'll repeat it. But I do think there is an element of understanding, you know, how the past is impacting today.
Right. And for instance, there's I think a narrative that I've heard, a narrative that I probably bought into to a certain extent when I came to Western North Carolina as a young adult, lo these many years ago, that there's not, the reason why there's not a strong and there's not as strong an African-American community in Western North Carolina as in some other regions of the South is that there was not a significant slave presence in Western North Carolina. And as I learned that that was not true, that there was a significant slave presence, then yeah, that leads to some more challenging, maybe uncomfortable questions about today, you know. So I guess that's kind of what I was driving after too, is to say that, you know, our common narrative, what we believe about ourselves today are shaped by our common mystery, or excuse me, our common history. Common mysteries, that's theology. We'll talk about that another time. But our
mystery is still a mystery. It's fine.
Oh yeah. But those why didn't they abolish slavery in 1787 when they had a shot? But that's a different story. But that we do have, I mean, I guess there's this perception that, well, history is history. You can't change history. But when you came in and found all of this documentation about slave life, it's not as if you could just put all of that out on the table and go for it. You know, we still have a responsibility in terms of shaping our memory. So how do you understand that idea of forming a common story or common memory?
I think it's complicated because
Sure.
I don't know if you can necessarily ever say form, I don't know, common memory, but what I would say I would encourage, and what I'm trying to do in interpretation and museums and historic sites is really at this, like, what I want people to do is just start to question, right? Like, that's what makes good historians, makes good community members, to just question and think a bit more about what you're learning in the different perspectives. So I think the way that you form, you know, if you're trying to form more of a common understanding, is how I would think of it, is that it's important to try and understand it from a lot of different points of view. So it makes me think about this time, you know, I went to this training a year and a half ago, and it was through the Smithsonian's African American History and Culture Museum. And they partnered with Charleston County Parks and a couple other organizations, the African American Association of Museums, Southeastern Museums Conference. It was a training, and you had to apply. There were 10 people from all over the country, really, that came together in Charleston. It was a week-long training on interpreting African American history. And, you know, at this point, I'm thinking, like, I've been interpreting African American history and slavery and plantations for at that point, 12 years I've been doing this. And so I go to this training. I had applied because honestly, I hit a bit of a wall at Vance with some of the pushback and what was happening there on a daily basis. And I was just looking for more growth in interpretation. And so I went to the training, and one of the days was sitting there, we were supposed to be we're working on some programming elements for the site. And I said, to one of the leaders of the program, I said, I'm really struggling because, I want to tell this narrative, but I don't have any artifacts, objects from that actually, from the enslaved people to tell the story. I don't have any original artifacts. And he said, let me ask you, how many of the artifacts in the Vance house are original to the Vance family? And I said, 3.
Uh-huh.
3 of the hundreds of artifacts in the house are original to the Vance family. And he said, but yet you make a story for the Vances every single day.
Right.
And I was like,
right.
Oh my goodness, I do that. And he was like, you just literally have to, even something as simple as we have a cradle in the sitting room, in the basically living room. And, we've used that to tell all kinds of narratives. It's by the fireplace. We talk about, trying to stay warm. We talk about the length of the cradle. We talk about, mortality rates. We talk about, health, all these things. And I'm like, I could have easily used it to talk about Venus, who was the woman who was taking care of the Vance children.
Right. Right.
And I think it's just so easy to stay in one perspective. So when you're talking about a common memory or a common understanding, I think it's just the way you get there and the way you think about that is just, when I say question, I mean to continuously question how you're approaching something or thinking about it. Or honestly, to me as a historian, public historian, I feel like my job is to never become complacent.
Uh-huh.
Never just be like, well, that's it. That's history done.
History told. You're
Learned
welcome. Yeah. Well, and that raises for me, the question, the idea, sort of the concept that how we imagine history, how we imagine the history around that cradle has a lot to do with our own experiences with an artifact like that. Mm-hmm. How we understand the significance of some of these monuments that are around. And by the way, I know that there is a monument in downtown Asheville that has the name. Yes. Here's a name. We're talking about the monuments at Calvary. We're not talking about the monument downtown Asheville.
Yes.
So, but how we understand those stories, really, it says as much about us and what we're bringing to them as it does about the stories that are being told.
Absolutely. Well, and I think it's one of those, history is not it's not one thing. It's not stagnant. It's not like, 1830, Vance was born. There was this event even where it's like, Civil War happened. These events happen, but how we understand them are constantly changing and additional things are happening. And especially when it comes to monuments, you have a monument that's erected at a certain time and it is representing something at that time. But then there are other events that are happening around that monument and around the memory of what that monument is associated with. So, that's what but it's kind of like any other symbol, symbols can be adopted, symbols can be changed historically, how we remember monuments and the events that happen around it. Let's say you could agree with when a monument was erected, why it was erected, but that doesn't negate the other things that may have happened around it or events around it at that time. And I think to have a common, understanding would be to make sure that you're aware of all of the history associated with it.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just say, making sure that you're telling that broad and inclusive story. Monuments are a little different, obviously, than historic sites, right? Because monuments are typically, created to memorialize something, whereas, the mission of, say, the Vance birthplace is not to memorialize or venerate Zebulon Vance. It's meant to, even before I switched the narrative, the point was to educate people on him and his impact and his policies, and and his father and his grandfather and his mother and all the people on the property. So I think, we want to be, it's like we want to put history in this little box and certain events, and it just doesn't work that way.
Well, and the same thing's true about the church. I mean, people make choices at different times, whether it's in relationship to theology or worship, or, not that these things are totally disconnected,
Mm-hmm.
but in particular, there are times people might choose to give emphasis to a certain thing because they have seen it diminished in the past,
Mm-hmm.
And I think that particularly for Calvary, that's part of the story, is this, in the generation immediately following the Civil War, this deep shame about the Civil War and slavery and so forth. And so this attempt to kind of emphasize, well, not everything about the South was bad. But then that course correction becomes its own issue, and there are certain aspects, for instance, of the Protestant Reformation that I can be very clear about their having gone a little bit too far,
Yeah.
So it seems like that's a natural part of both the practice of religion and the study of history, is to go back and kind of say, okay, maybe we need to strip away some of these things and maybe even, revisit that course correction and see, maybe that sent us a little bit, too far down one path.
One other overlap I would say that I see between, religion and studying history, there's this common thread of, if you're doing like public history, I think it's extremely important to have compassion and understanding. I often, when I'm training staff and talking to them about, interpreting necessary history and the different reactions that people have, is just trying to understand that sometimes, people are learning this for the first time. And if it's something that they identify as who they are, I get it. When I remember when I was 8 and I went to Mordecai Historic Park, which I ended up working at as an adult, but I was 8 and I remember vividly going in the garden with a woman in Civil War period dress and feeling the lamb's ear. That stuck with me. But so I have this kind of childhood nostalgia almost associated with that site. So you learn these things and you have these associations. And so it can be difficult when you learn something new that challenges that. And so I think, that overlying theme of trying, when you're doing it well, being compassionate and understanding. And I think that's also how you get that common memory and that common understanding is recognizing that if someone's, there are different levels of reactions. Sometimes people will come to the Vance birthplace and they're sad. Sometimes people come to the Vance birthplace and they're mad. Sometimes they're, rejecting it altogether. There are all kinds of different ways that people will react, and allowing that space for that reaction. Obviously, if someone were to take it to a level of inappropriate or violent or anything like that, obviously we would end it. But within reason, I think, allowing for that space, but then also correcting it. And that's just what happens with when you're correcting a narrative and you're dealing with that loss of learning and people are struggling, having that compassion, trying to meet people where they are and saying, I hear you. I understand that this is different and that it's difficult. But also saying if someone says, for example, I've had a lot of people come to the site and they'll say, I feel like they're there. I don't know who there is, but I feel like they're erasing history. And that happens a lot. And, I will typically say, I hear you and I understand that it feels that way, but there is room for all of it. And I want you to think about what it would feel like if your history wasn't erased, but if it was never told.
Right.
And so usually, just that compassion and understanding and having that space for that.
Well, and the fact that we can be standing in a place like the Vance birthplace, like Calvary Church,
Mm-hmm.
that with two people, one of whom their understanding of that place is the legacy family and how they tried to contribute to culture and the ideals that they had about what agriculture could be in this place. And another person whose ancestors had no choice when they came to that place, and the material things of that place are the only memory that exists of them, because they couldn't read or write and so forth. So both both of those people's stories are true to a certain extent, and it's interesting to hear you talk about the loss of learning or the loss of understanding. There's a concept in pastoral counseling and in working with people who are in a crisis from a spiritual place, and that's the idea that a loss of future story, that a change that they are experiencing has they imagine a narrative for their future, and then that won't happen anymore, and I can see how it could also be difficult, and you have to grieve that loss, know, and so it makes sense that you would have to grieve the loss of a past story, a history. You have to grieve the loss of a history that you come to find out is either not accurate or not complete or something like that. So that need for compassion as we do that work makes a lot of sense.
And there's room for both. I've had people who will, have contacted us and, are upset because, and the argument is, well, Vance did this and Vance did this good thing and Vance did this good thing, and he brought salt to North Carolina during the Civil War so people didn't starve, so they survived. And I'm like, I agree with you, those are all facts, but he didn't necessarily care about salt and the survival of everyone. And I think you just have to recognize all of those truths, like those are all truths. So understanding all of it, I think, is where you get into that, what you were referencing as far as like a common memory. Is just that is if you're understanding, all of that. It's
Well, so that's interesting. I mean, to have a shared or a common memory today, we have to include the memories of the individual people who are standing here today. Yeah, or vice versa. If we want to make sure that everybody is standing here today, then we have to work to bring all of their stories through history. Yeah. So, yeah, there's a lot of good pieces there, and I think there's a lot for us to at Calvary to consider. One of the things I appreciate is I had a seminary theology professor in seminary who said good theology raises more questions than it answers. You know, if a theologian ever gives you a response that ends the conversation, then they're not a very good theologian. You know? So.
Yeah, one of the stories I think I had mentioned to you when you first reached out, it was right after I had gotten a phone call. And this one I shouldn't say I have no answers. I do have answers, but I will not voice them on this recording. But I got a phone call. I told you about that. Someone called me and at the site and said, I was just driving the parkway and I noticed that someone had vandalized the Vance birthplace sign and spray painted racist on it. And I was like, oh, okay, you know, thank you for letting me know. I really appreciate it. And he was like, well, I just want you to know that I happen to have some black spray paint, a can of black spray paint in my car. So I pulled over and I covered it up. So I took care of it for you. And I was like, oh dear.
Yeah. Did you know? Yeah.
So you know, I also, it's one of those, I mean, I think honestly, that's a perfect example of when you're thinking about history and this memory and how we interpret and what we focus on and our approach. You know, there were so many emotions that person was feeling, both people were feeling when they vandalized it. And honestly, the first vandalism, you know, wasn't inaccurate. I'm not condoning vandalism.
Right. But they're not wrong.
They're not wrong.
You
know, but I just find it so fascinating, you know, that both of them probably felt like they were right.
Right.
You know,
and there is a respect in which they are both right about the truth about Zebulon Vance and how we talk to each other in a civilized society. Yeah. So, well, let me open this up and see if the folks who have joined us, if you're watching on Facebook and you have questions, I'm not able to do 4 things at once, so I'm barely able to do one thing at a time. So I'm not going to be able to answer your questions if you're on Facebook, and I apologize for that. If you'll email, if you have a question or a comment you want to have heard, if you'll email that to me, I'll certainly take a look at it. We can include it in the future conversations. But for folks who are here on Zoom, I would love to hear from y'all questions or thoughts that you have about this conversation and about forming common memory at Calvary. Go ahead, Drew.
Yeah, Jay, I was actually struck by, and first off, Kimberly, let me start where I should start, which is a very heartfelt thank you for sharing both about your work, about your deep conviction around the work, about your own ongoing evolution in thinking and reimagination, if you will, and recharging, right, with the work that you did with the Smithsonian, and an opportunity to even see where you were blind. And I say that simply because to say that I'm an avid every Sunday worshiper would be what's called a lie. But what got me engaged in this conversation is I am an avid historian. I am working with many historians to rethink how history is taught to hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of undergraduates in the US. And I was blind to the fact and really just assumed that that narrative about there not being many slaves in Western North Carolina, I never noticed the monuments at my church when I did go more actively, right? Mm. And so, point that I'm getting at is I was fairly immersed in my discipline and my work to the point where I didn't even notice elements of history that were right there in front of me. So I just want to, point that out. I want to jump to, Jay, a comment you made, and it was a throwaway. You meant no harm by it. It was, your comment about if only in 1787. They had, and I say it in part because the same people in person, if you will, who penned "All Men Are Created Equal" had a strong hand in making sure what was or what wasn't in those enabling documents, right?
Yep.
And I bring that up, and I want to give some context to this. First off, I don't know if you're Kimberly or Jay or Mother Nan, if you've read Annette Gordon Reed's book, The Hemingses of Monticello. It's a wonderful book that traces not just slavery, not just about Sally Hemings, but about really the growth of slavery and race-based inequity in the U.S. But I mention it because Annette Gordon Reed is the author, and I follow her on Twitter because I have no hobbies. And she wrote about 3 weeks ago on Twitter, could you both love and hate someone at the same time, asking for a friend, right? And of course she was speaking of Jefferson, whom one abolitionist wrote, never did a man achieve more fame for what he did not do, right? Mm-hmm. Penning the all men are created equal. But at the same time, in Notes of Virginia, basically saying, yeah, but blacks really aren't men, right? So therefore, you can have your cake and eat it too. And even at the same time that the Constitution was being written, writing to some guy named George Washington and say, my slaves accrue 4% in value every year and they have babies. So I'm just getting richer by the minute. It's that history that has gotten not just short shrifted, but hidden, right? That Jefferson's family made sure any mention of Sally was eradicated. And I think what the study of history in an ongoing fashion has done, at least for me, is allowed me to see where this narrative actually does exist and how active those who have dominated the writing of history have been in hiding it. And what a tremendous opportunity we have, right? In modern day with Hemings and Jefferson, it's through DNA. Well, we can look at our metaphorical DNA. We can look into records to the extent they exist because chattel slaves were deemed property and property records tended to be pretty good. And look at what's our DNA and how do we more accurately reflect that in our story in ways that many people tried very hard to make sure we couldn't do. So I'll stop with the sermon now. Forgive me. There are just many things that you had shared. And Jay, it was your comment, but it wasn't, right? I mean, it goes back to elements. And Kimberly, thank you again. If it makes you feel any better, you're clearly not alone in your struggle, a very good struggle, at least so I believe. So you have one fan, right? So.
Yeah. Well, and Drew, thank you for that. I mean, part of what I was kind of intentionally and unintentionally dragging up with that comment is that moment is particularly fraught. I mean, we have we had I believe it was a congressman this week saying that slavery was a necessary evil in terms of getting the Constitution passed in that period. And I think a lot of us looked at that and said, was it though? And that particular era, the more one digs into it, the more one gets into one of these situations that Kimberly was talking about, was like, there's, this raises more questions than it answers. And it raises questions for us in this moment about our ability to blind ourselves to the moral implications of things like climate change and systemic racism, and for goodness sake, wearing a mask. But that's a whole different conversation. The other piece, in terms of studying our DNA, is one person in a conversation during these last 2 weeks brought up, not directly but indirectly, or didn't say quite this way, that our people are actually buried in the churchyard, and there are people in that churchyard whose stories represent pretty much every facet of the stories that we may be trying to tell with those monuments, or we may be arguing over those monuments. And it's one thing to try to support or defend or argue against those monuments, but it's another thing to say, well, what are the stories of the people in our churchyard? Who are they? And because those are our stories. And I wonder for you, Kimberly, you did talk about that the story of the Vance birthplace is not just the story of Zebulon Vance, but it is that place. I mean, there is significance to that place and his story in that place. And so I wonder, does that make a difference? How does that play into it? That that's the actual spot,
The way that I look at it, specifically with the Vance birthplace, is one, I would love to change the name of the site, because yes, Zebulon Vance was born there, but there were a lot of people born there. So I don't think I feel comfortable with telling the stories of everybody who was born there. I just haven't really, while it's the Vance birthplace, there were lots of people born in that house. And so I just, telling African-American history and telling women's history and slavery, I think is important. So, as far as place, one thing that I've been working on is a program that I want to do with a community partner. We've just been trying to raise money for it. And this was before COVID, but I had wanted to partner with some of the local schools around the site and see about getting students, we were talking about middle school, to come out and basically a project on reclaiming the narrative. And the question was going to be, one thing, and you've probably heard of these, but this, the idea of witness trees, like trees that have been around for years and years and witnessed these large events. At Gettysburg or whatever. But, we have trees on the Vance property that have been around longer than that house was. The Vance birthplace is a reconstruction. The slave dwelling that we have is from the 1790s. So, one of the things we talked about was having the kids create art projects based around the question of, if the trees could talk, what would they say? Mm-hmm. And, to be honest, I don't think that the focus would be Zebulon Vance. Right. I think it would be the whole story, right? There was a whole plantation network thing happening there. So I don't, I just don't think that, that's my personal opinion. But I also, one thing I've said recently I was talking with our assistant site manager, and I said, we just updated our self-guided tour sheet. And we've been changing that thing. We're constantly updating that thing with new verbiage and new things. And we learn something new and then we change it again. And I said to her, I was like, I am just fascinated to know what public historians and museum professionals, how is it going to continue to change? Because it will, and I hope it does, as far as interpretive perspective. How is it going to change? And what are the like people who are who are going to come behind me, and they're going to see my self-guided map and be like, oh my goodness, I can't believe they were using this word or that word, and change it. And I'm like, what is that going to be 10 years from now? What? Because for me, I remember 10 years ago I was working at Mordecai. I remember when it became very prevalent in the academic community to start talking. We were talking about terminology around slavery. And that was really when we started transition to start using the term enslaved people versus slaves. That was 10 years ago. We were doing that. And I'm like, now there's a lot of conversation about, slave owners versus enslavers and how you're using your terminology and how you're thinking and approaching history. And I think it's one of those things that, again, I know I've said this many times, but you don't become complacent. It constantly changes. So even if it's this place, that house where Vance was born, I think it's important, one, to tell all the stories, but I don't think necessarily that the place itself has so many stories to tell other than just the birth of Vance.
Right. Well, and I mean that's a part of contextualizing Vance within a larger, Zebulon Vance within a larger story and a larger,
of course,
larger history. So, Mother Nan, did you have a question?
Yeah, I was. We were talking about working with the children, and I feel like we still teach one story to children in elementary school, and then in college you get the real story. For example, I remember, we put Lincoln on a pedestal, and rightly so, for ending slavery, but in college you learn, well, he was really about keeping the Union together, and the way he did it was by ending slavery. It's a little different nuance.
Yeah.
That makes him a little less of a hero, And then, you learn that the age of exploration is when, the Western European culture is going all over the world. And then we learn that's really the era of exploitation, not the era of exploration. You know what I'm saying? When are we going to start teaching it from the beginning? Mm-hmm. That might be why we're having a hard time seeing things, if we're not being taught them from the beginning.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I think that relates back to kind of what I was talking about with that loss of learning. People are hearing it one way their entire life, and I think they're struggling with it because they're being confronted with something that's so different than what they learned. I do think that is changing, and it's not as quickly as I would hope. I can give you an example. At the Vance birthplace, our school program has changed drastically. That was one thing that I was really passionate about. That's really where my strength and my experience has been, programming for literally thousands of children on slavery. So, I think sometimes people I have found even in training staff that they're nervous to sometimes expose children to, again, difficult topics, but they're not really difficult. And in fact, kids can handle quite a bit. But, what is difficult, I think, when you start talking about children's programming is because you're dealing, for example, when we have a school group come, you have the teacher, you have parents, the bus driver, people who will join the tour, and everybody's bringing their own biases, their own opinions, their own history, and they will sometimes cut in on tours. But one thing that I found that was happening at Vance is, we were talking about slavery, and we were talking about plantations, and we would get phone calls from teachers to schedule, not all, we have plenty of wonderful teachers in school groups, but some school groups were calling and wanting to schedule and saying, we're going to come, but we don't want you to talk to the kids we don't want you to take the kids in the slave dwelling. We don't want you to talk about slavery. You know, and, you know, I've said, and my assistant manager will say, you know, we're going to talk about slavery. So if you come here, your kids are going in the slave dwelling. You know, honestly, what ended up happening is we would have people come and they would go through the Vance house. And then when we went into go to the slave dwelling, they would run out of time. So again, that is one of those things. It makes me think about, I think it was Drew, you said, what's your name? It makes me think about where it was right in front of my face. I was driving to work. This was less than a year ago. I was driving to work and I came into work and I got to my assistant manager and I was like, oh my gosh, like, I don't know why I didn't think of this before. And I was like, just flip the tour. And I was like, just start at the slave dwelling. And she was like, you're right. Like, why are we doing this? Why are we starting at the Vance house? You know, we've been doing that. We've been doing it so long that it's just like, oh, this is just the way it's done. And so now we flipped it and we all the kids go through the slave dwelling first. But again, I think it takes that recognition, acknowledging it, changing it, and doing that kind of thing.
Yeah.
Don't they run out of time before they get to the Vance house?
You know, they don't.
Really?
Shocking.
That's amazing. That's shocking. That's shocking.
Informal research there.
Yes, exactly.
You know, I have often joked and said that I think public historians should get dual degrees in history and or public historians should get like public history and museum studies in psychology.
Yeah.
So
I have a quick comment about Mother Nan's comment, and I'll attempt to keep it to like 90 seconds, I swear. Your mentioning of Lincoln actually serves as a wonderful metaphor for our own potential evolution around this, right? Because Lincoln in 1862, right before the eve of writing the Emancipation Proclamation, in its first draft, wrote to Horace Greeley and said, if I could save the Union by not freeing a single slave, I'd do it. If I could save the Union by freeing all the slaves, I'd do it. It's all about the Union. But Lincoln in 1865 was very different than Lincoln in 1862. And I mean pre, theater Lincoln, no horrible joke intended here. He evolved vastly. And even the initial verbiage of the initial Emancipation Proclamation in September, and then that went into effect in early 1863, he eliminated a whole segment about recolonizing freed slaves because you solve the race issue by getting rid of the race. I mean, that's not what he wrote, but that's what in essence he was writing. Frederick Douglass and abolitionists helped him see the light there, right? So point I get at is Lincoln himself in 3-4 years evolved vastly from where he was. And on some level, it gives me tremendous hope. I mean, I'm not saying we're all Lincoln, but I am saying that, we're evolving ourselves even through these conversations about where we might go, how we may interpret and how we can see things differently within our own chapel. So it was a great piece to bring up, Mother Nan. I think it's something to point to as we go forward. It's a way to look at how we see things more fully and want to make sure representation inclusion occurs and not a move it out of here sort of a note there. That was more than 90 seconds. Sorry.
Yeah, time.
Kimberly, I wanted to say thank you, Kimberly, and all of you that have commented. And I'm certainly not a historian, but I am a clinical social worker, and my whole life has been about how you companion people's stories. And how do we be present in the story, and how do we hear a story without projecting our own bias so that we can welcome it and hold it, and then we can hold it up to the light and look at it. And for growing community capacity and growing our own individual capacity, I really appreciate the courage it takes to ask questions and hold ourselves in the questions. And I think there's a real invitation here for us not to be complacent and to really broaden the breadth of how we see a sense of place. whether it's at the Vance birthplace or at Calvary, in the churchyard, in our households, and in our neighborhoods. So I really appreciate this conversation tonight, because I think there's some really powerful invitations about how we talk about a sense of place, and how that includes everybody's story. Thank you for that. Yep.
And I think, Deacon Jackie, as you talk about that, I'm reminded again both of this idea about the trees and the fact that in the Garden of Gethsemane, there are olive trees that are, they're 2,000 years old.
Mm-hmm.
They were witness to what happened in the garden on the night of the Passion, and these trees are, for some reason I had this idea in my head of olive trees as delicate, and, these trees are thick and gnarled and knotty, but they're still raising themselves up to the light, and they're still producing fruit, and so that whole idea of bearing witness to all of our stories and how that can strengthen us and root us in this place, I think is all very helpful. So thank you, Kimberly.
Yeah.
Thank you, everybody who has joined us. Thanks to everybody who is on Facebook tonight. Again, we'll take a few weeks off, and then we'll come back and start moving towards the next step in this conversation. So rest up, because we've got more work to do. So thank you all.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you all.
Thank you. Have a good night.
You
Good
too.
night. Good night.